Yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay, guys, I'm so sorry for my frozen camera and my being lost here because I'm having some technical issues. But welcome back to our summer school on Brazilian studies, our third day of our second week. And I hope you're having fun. I hope you're enjoying. It's been such nice days together, getting to know a little bit more about Brazil. And today we have the honor of having back Professor Cristiano Rodrigues. He's been with us for a while, I think since last edition. And it's such a pleasure to have you back and hear your insightful lecture. As always, you have so many nice things to say and so many nice things to share. And we're so proud to have you here with us once again, hopefully for the following years to come, and hopefully face to face, right, next time. And so thank you very much, Professor Cristiano, who will be talking to us about this such an important issue for our times nowadays. And we are delighted to have you, Professor Cristiano, to talk about race in Brazil. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here for the second time. Last year, again, for the second year again, doing this online, but hopefully next year we'll all be here together at the campus. And as the last year, I'll be talking about this topic, which I think is very important on race in Brazil, which is a very broad topic with many questions and research areas. That's very hard to cover it all, especially in such a short time. But I will try to do like glimpses of everything we talk about race in Brazil since, I don't know, the 1900s until now. And I will focus especially on politics and political representation, and especially Afro-Brazilian under political representation nowadays. So I will do some history on the black on race and racism in Brazil, and then we'll start talking about political representation. Can we start? I have okay. I have a presentation for us. I will like just put everyone here. Okay, great. So race in Brazil, it's going to be the topic. Oh, sorry. Okay, here are the general topics I will be talking about. So I will begin talking about race and racism in Brazil. Then race, class, and social mobility, race and political representation. And under this umbrella of race and political representation, I will be tackling two questions. One on the effects of racism on national politics, especially talking about the underrepresentation of Black and especially Black women in politics in Brazil. And then on the importance of what I call here descriptive representation. And I will be using, especially on on the part of political representation, parts of my own work on political representation in Brazil and the work of colleagues who have also studied these questions of underrepresentation. All right. Again, tá difícil. Okay, so to talk about race in Brazil, I mean, it's a very difficult topic, not only in Brazil, I would say around the world, and also in many countries in Latin America, because there's what I call like a very fluid sense of race and ethnicity in many countries in Latin America, where what I call like the color line, man, this idea of like black, whites, indigenous people, Asian descendant people, and many other racial and ethnical groups, they're very intertwined with national identities and the weight of racism in each country, and also an idea that runs across Latin American countries of racial mixture as being a sign of lack of racism. And that somehow positions Black identities, especially Black identities in the continent, as very weakened, as a very weakened identity, and also in terms of the possibility of politicizing it in order to gain equal rights with whites and other social groups in Latin America. So when we talk about race and class, and race and national identity in Brazil, we have to take that into account. So to begin with, I would say that until the mid 1800s, the Brazilian society didn't think of itself in terms of race. What I want to say here, what I try to say here is that back in the day, as a colonial country, Brazil had the people who were free and those who were enslaved, and also some indigenous people. There's a lot of killing of indigenous people, and today, like, they are very little part of the Brazilian population. But even though we didn't think much in terms of race, but more about those who are free and those who are enslaved. But then the Black Brazilian population back then, what is this? The Black Brazilian population back then was made up of, I think, Blacks made up like 2/3 of the Brazilian population, and whites were only 1/3. Whites and indigenous were about 1/3 of the Brazilian population back then. But then, when the conversations on the ending of slavery began, we also started to think about race. For what reason? Okay, so what I'm trying to say here. However, after the end of slavery, the question about what to do with the Blacks emerged. What I mean here is race arises as a question in Brazil when we don't have slavery anymore. And then we have such a large Black population. And the ideas of a society being civilized and modern had a lot to do with the society being white. So we have like a whole lot of scientific or pseudo-scientific theories on race and national identity, especially eugenics and other theories that reign in the same, that had the same ideas. And then a country like Brazil, they were composed mostly by Black people and indigenous people, could not afford to be considered modern or civilized. And then a lot of ideas on what to do with Blacks emerged then to try to compromise the idea of a non-white country and a modern country at the same time. So from the 1880s to the 1900s, Brazilian state sponsored the immigration of about 3.5 million white Europeans, especially from Italy, Germany, and Spain. What is the idea, like the underlying idea here? If a non-white society was bad for a country, as the theories back then would say, what the Brazilian state did was try to bring as many Europeans as possible to whiten the society. So this idea of whitening the society, it's very dear to the Brazilian national identity. We cannot think about Brazil or how Brazil has become the country it has become without thinking about the politics of whitening. And this politics of whitening had many versions. I think the main version, or the two main versions, are one we call racial democracy, and the other one had to do with sponsoring the immigration of white Europeans. And why we didn't choose, for example, other Portuguese descendant people to come to Brazil back then. The idea was also to deny not only the black blood in Brazil, but also the Portuguese blood. So the idea was to build up a new country that forgot its past, its colonial past, both in terms of slavery and also in terms of the Portuguese expression of this country. And also many other nationalities who aren't considered white enough back then didn't have the chance to be sponsored to immigrate to Brazil as Italians, Germans, and Spaniards people had. Okay, so the idea of whitening then was trying to bringing those people to Brazil and make them mix with the blacks and indigenous people who already lived in Brazil. And the idea was that if white bloods, white traits were better off than black and indigenous traits, with the mixing throughout the times, Brazil would become a very white society. So the idea of bringing Europeans had nothing to do with popularizing the society or bringing more people to work. It had way more to do with trying to, throughout the times, make this society as a wider society instead of a society that was like mixed race or black. And the racial democracy, which is another theory that together with the whitening explains Brazil a lot, is the idea that that Brazil, the black Brazilians, indigenous Brazilians, Asian descendant Brazilians, white Brazilians, we all live together in a sort of harmony. And because there's this harmony, we wouldn't have a racial problem as the United States or South Africa or many other countries have. So this idea is still runs is still very deep in Brazil. A lot of Brazilians still believe that we are a racial democracy and that our problems have nothing to do with race, but with class. And I will try to explain that more later. So. And here again, the state portrayed African blood as inferior to European blood and promoted immigration policies to whiten and thereby improve the population. So this is the main idea behind the immigration, the sponsoring of European immigrants to Brazil in this period I'm talking about here. And then just to explain, to give you guys an example of how many people were brought to Brazil, both as enslaved people and then those who were sponsored to come here as immigrants. The data we have nowadays show this amount of people who were brought, like Africans who were brought to Brazil, enslaved. So we have here, sorry. From 1781 until 1855, those are the data we have. After this data, bringing Africans to Brazil was prohibited. And we have, the data show that we had around 3 million Africans brought to Brazil during this time. Then we have the European immigration, which was from 1820 to 1975. Those are the data I have here. But as I told you guys before, I mean, if you start here, 1870, and you go until 1929, it's the largest amount of people who came to Brazil. And how it works. So the enslaved people came, as we all know, everywhere on planets. So they were they were taken for their lands and brought to America and had to work for free and for many years and had the rights, like the human rights, denied in every step of the way. But the Europeans were brought to Brazil. They had their tickets paid by the states, and also they get a little amount of money to come to Brazil. And also they got a piece of land, especially in the southern part of Brazil, like in the areas that today we call the south of Brazil, the southern part of Brazil, and São Paulo, to start farming in this country. So even if they came here, many of them were poor people in their countries of origin. They arrived in Brazil better off than their Black and indigenous counterparts. And that explains a lot of the inequities we have in Brazil nowadays. That like the inequality in terms of access to the job market, to education, health, political representation, and many others. All these inequities have a lot to do with the ways that white European, and Black Africans were brought to Brazil, and how it like the pervasive way racism explains this. Okay, so here I'd like to talk about some peculiarities of how race and racism work in Brazil. So first, it's important to say that race in Brazil refers mostly to skin color of physical appearance rather than to ancestry. So the way race and racism work in different countries has a lot to do with the context of those countries. So in Brazil, race has to do with his skin color. So the darker somebody's skin color is, the more discriminated against this person is, and fewer opportunities this person has. And that may change in different parts of the Brazil as well. So if you go to the northeastern part of Brazil, where the largest Black population live, a person who is seen as Black in the south of Brazil may not be seen as Black in the northern part of Brazil because of the way color plays an important role in different parts of the country as well. And then a second thing that's important to note is that Brazil is a nation that on the surface appears to be colorblind, but where the legacy of slavery remains. And what I'm trying to say here is, usually Brazilians don't talk about race in a day-to-day basis. We avoid to say, oh, this person is Black, this person is not Black. We very often use euphemism to refer to somebody's skin color. We try not to politicize the idea of race and racism being a very important way of Brazilians to think about each other. But like underneath, racism is very persistent and salient in our society. And then there's this confusion between coexistence and racial equality. Just to give you guys an example that we use a lot in Brazil, like we would say that, okay, American in the United States, there were built these state laws, the Jim Crow laws, that would separate Blacks from whites, like the idea of separate but equals. Brazil has never had any policy like that. But it's still a very segregated society. If you come to Brazil and you go to a upper middle class neighborhood or a private school or a good university in Brazil, you may see that you're not gonna see a lot of Black Brazilians or non-white Brazilians in these areas of the country. But it may seem that's only because of class, since there's a higher correlation between poverty and skin color in Brazil. So this idea that, and also if you go to places where, like, if you go to the beach, if you go to a concert, if you walk down the streets, you're gonna see blacks and whites coexisting and sharing this space in the same way. What gives, at a first glimpse, an idea there's no racism in Brazil. Another thing, there's a higher rate of interracial marriage in Brazil. That's around 20% of the marriages in Brazil are what we call interracial marriage. And then some people would say that if you live such intimate relationships with other Brazilians from different racial backgrounds, this means that probably there's no racism in this country. But then, as I explained earlier, when we talk about racial intermarriage in Brazil, we're mainly talking about a state-sponsored policy that came about because of the sponsored immigration of, the sponsored immigration of white Europeans with the intent to make them marry non-white Brazilians and whiten the society. And also there are many other explanations about how racial intermarriage works in Brazil, and I can explain that later because this is not the main topic I want to talk. I want to explain here, but that shows that this idea that interracial marriage equals non-racist is just fake, false. Again, in terms of racial classification in Brazil, there's what I call a continuum that goes from white to black, in which people want to identify themselves and be identified by others with the former category, but not with the latter one. So, and the sentence that's from the research on race and racism in Brazil that shows that each Brazilian thinks of him or herself as being an island of racial democracy surrounded by racists from all sides. From all sides. There is this thing that I call majority minority, or how racial democracy and whitening ideologies weighted down black identity. Because there's the racial mixture complicates the racial, the black identity. Afro-Brazilians have what I call a weak racial consciousness. And Brazilians use hundreds of terms to classify one another according to skin color and phenotypical traits. And I will show that later as well. And any given race or color term can, in a given conversation, be used to describe, to tease, to insult, or to flatter. So just to give an example, somebody may say in one of this app dating, one of this app dating like Tinder and stuff, and say, "Oh, I love black people," or "I love your skin color," and then call somebody in using that same term in a derogatory way. So in a conversation with a black person or a person who is a non-white person, that may happen a lot, that their skin tone may be used to tease them, to flatter and say, "Oh, I love you. I love your skin tone. I'd love to have a skin like that." Or, "Oh, I love your hair," and stuff like that. And at the same time saying, "Oh, you're not good enough." And to navigate this nuance on how the term can be used just to oppress you as to flatter you, it's a very difficult thing for the Brazilians, especially the Afro-Brazilians. Just to show you, because I said on the former slide, I was saying that Brazilians use hundreds of terms to describe their colors. And also I talked about a continuum in which people want to be identified as white, but don't want to be identified as black. Because being identified as black means being seen as poor, uneducated, less human, and Brazilians don't want to be seen like that. So there's this census in 1976. They asked people about their color and race, but then the question was an open question. A person could answer anything she wanted. And then Brazilians came with 135 terms to describe their colors, which ran from, I mean, I have no way to translate any of those colors, but it goes, is a wide range of ways of saying that they are not black, basically. So many studies on this census have shown that what they mean is this, that Brazilians use color as a transitory category. As if I said, oh, if I went to the swimming pool and I got tanned, then I say I'm moreno, which it's somehow brown in English. Então, so somebody can be tanned, which means at that point in time, she or he thinks she's darker skinned. But then next day, when this person is not tanned anymore, then she might think of herself as a white person. So there's this sense of color being a passing thing in Brazil and not a very statutory thing. Okay, and then we, in terms of racial classification, we also have many ways of dealing with it. There's a way that it works in the census. So the census asks about your color in 5 ways. He asks if you are white, black, mixed race, which in Brazil is pardo, and I'm translating here as brown, indigenous or Asian descendant. But those are not the categories that usually Brazilians use themselves to describe their skin colors. And then you have what I call the extra-official categories that are more used among Brazilians. And then there is moreno. Moreno, it's a very difficult word to translate. I mean, it's being translated as brown, but especially in the US, brown usually means South Asian and Latino, and people of Latino regions, which is different from the meaning we have as brown in Brazil. But I will work with this category, just asking you guys to keep in mind that the brown, it's not exactly the same thing as moreno. But moreno is a wide category in Brazil, because moreno can be a white person who has darker features, like somebody who has black hair or has black eyes, and also can be someone who is black but has a more fair skin and not so dark as somebody else. So moreno is a category that blurs whites and blacks. So a black person can call himself moreno, but a white person can also do so. So it's a very difficult category, but it's the most commonly used in Brazil among the population. And then you have a classification used mainly by Black social movements that draws a line between whites and blacks. So you would put together people who call themselves morenos, mixed race, and other people in a category of black, and then the other category would be white. Our, let's see, good. Our studies, the research on race relations in Brazil has evolved since its inception, I would say, in the turn of the 20th century to now, to think about the weight of racism in Brazil. So we had, back in the day, like in the 30s, when like the comparative research with the United States began, we had this idea that there was little or no racial discrimination in Brazil. Gilberto Freire, who wrote Casa Grande Senzala, I don't know how to say that in English. I forgot, actually. and Carl Degler and Marvin Harris and Donald Pearson, who are Americans who came to Brazil to study race relations in Brazil and compare them to the US, they would say there was no racial discrimination in Brazil, or if it was racial discrimination, that was residuary. There was like some peripheral thing that was not central to the society. And that racial differences were conditioned by class. What that means, that class was the category that defined inequalities in Brazil and not race. And therefore, racial discrimination was irrelevant. Okay, then back in the 50s, there was this large study sponsored by UNESCO on racial discrimination and racial relations in the world after the Second War, trying to find explanations on why people discriminated against each other. And there's this large research in Brazil that we call Projeto UNESCO. And then the findings of those researchers, especially Florestan Fernandes, Roger Bastide, Abdias do Nascimento, and Carl Degler, is the same Carl Degler from the first one, because he does two researches in Brazil. So the first one, he thinks there's no racial discrimination, and the second time he comes to study Brazil in more detail, he believes there is racial discrimination and is widespread. Okay, so the second wave of studies on race relations in Brazil will say, okay, there is racial discrimination, is widespread, but it's transitory. What did they believe? They believed that as Brazil became a more modern, capitalist-oriented society, racial discrimination would disappear, and then a class structure would show up as a more encompassing way of understanding inequalities in Brazil. And then you have a third wave of studies on race relations in Brazil. And Carlos Rasenbalg, Nelson do Vale Silva, are two authors who came with some of those ideas. So they say that racial discrimination is persistent and is structural and cannot be distinguished or explained by class. So what they do that's different, like they pick up non-white Brazilians who are in the middle class, who attended universities, and then study how racial discrimination operates for them to get less money for their work, for being more times, having more unemployment rates than white counterparts who have the same educational background, and many other ways. And in many other ways, they show that even among the same social class and the same social backgrounds, Black Brazilians still suffers from racial discrimination. And then that's not class that explains the inequalities between blacks and whites, but races. And that will not change if the society becomes more capitalist or more modern. So here, as I said back when I began this lecture, that in Brazil, race and class is very intertwined, and that it also not the same, it doesn't work the same way around the country. So here in the southern part of Brazil, as I said, like these three states, there are Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, and Paraná, the population is mostly white. Then you have the southeast of Brazil. The southeast of Brazil is the richest and more developed region in the country. They're composed by these states here: Minas Gerais, which we are now, Rio de Janeiro, Espírito Santo, and São Paulo. In these areas, you see that like you have a little bit more of Black people, but São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro less. Then we have what we call center-west. The center-west of part of Brazil are those countries, all those countries, those states here. And then also you have states that are like are not so white as the southern ones, but it's still the mixing is very it starts to become more salient. And then you have the north part of Brazil. These states here, they're more black and indigenous. And then you have also the northeast, which is also more black and indigenous, especially Bahia, which is the blackest, yes, yeah, is the state of that has the largest black population in the country, and is considered to have the largest black population outside of Africa. So in some cities of Bahia, like Salvador, blacks may comprise around 80 to 90% of the population. So here we have this chart on my right side. We have the chart showing that 48% of the Brazilian population describes themselves as whites. 43.8% of the Brazilian population describe themselves as pardo or brown or mixed race. It depends on how we classify. And then 6.5% of Brazilians describe themselves as blacks. And then we put together blacks and browns that show the majority of the Brazilian population is non-white. And then you have 0.9% of the population who might describe themselves as of Asian descent or indigenous descent. In terms of Human Development Index, we can also show how race and class again are intertwined. In the previous slide, I tell you guys the following. Oh, if you go up to the north, the darker the country is. The south, the wider the country is. And then in terms of human index, human development index is the same. So the wider the state is, the better is their HDI. And the darker the state is, the lower the HDI is. So we have to take that into account. As I've been saying since the beginning, that race and class is very intertwined in Brazil. One doesn't explain the discrimination on the basis of class, don't explain racism. Racism doesn't explain classism, but we cannot think then about them in separate ways. Okay, now race, class, and social mobility in Brazil. Race and class are, as I've said many times here, interconnected variables. And in Brazil, blacks and browns represent a higher percentage of those who grew up in lower economic classes. Although 56% of the total population, blacks and browns, compose 65% of people living below the poverty line, and 69% of those living in extremely poor conditions. And while a 25-year-old white Brazilian has an average 8.4 years of schooling, a black or brown Brazilian of the same age has only 60.1 years of schooling. So education is the major predictor of income. And though the average educational levels of both black and white Brazilians have increased significantly over the 20th century, the gap between them has remained relatively constant. Illiteracy among blacks and browns over 15 years of age is 28% versus 16% among whites. 52% of blacks live in households without adequate sanitation versus 28% of whites. 30% of blacks live in households without trash collection versus 15% of whites. 26% of blacks live in households without running water versus 80% of whites. Okay, so that was the main background to explain how racism works in Brazil. To then start drawing more on the state of the art, on political representation, and the underrepresentation of blacks in Brazilian politics. So the questions on race and political representation is, why do blacks remain underrepresented in the legislative and executive branches in Brazil? So there are main three reasons. One that we call party recruitment, or how the parties choose those who will run for office. Resource, how money is spending. Also, it's a very important aspect in racism. And I'll try to explain that in the next slides, as I show you. So in Brazil, we have now a public funding for parties. So depending on the size of the party, how many seats the party has already in the Congress or other branches of representation, this party gets an amount of money, and this amount of money goes to their candidates. So back until 2018, the country, the party didn't have to split this money evenly among the candidates. The party could choose the ones they thought had better chance to win the elections and give them more money. So money, if I could go back to the previous slide, where I say the resource is a very important predictor of how racism works. Sorry. The resource is one of the ways to show, to explain why Black Brazilians are underrepresented in politics, is because of that. So the parties tend to choose white, male, and already rich candidates to give them more money. And then money is the better predictor for knowing if a candidate has or no chances to be elected. So in this chart here, what I'm showing you guys is that if we give the same amount of money for a black candidate, or white candidate, and a mixed race candidate, a white candidate still has more chances to winning the elections than the brown and black ones. So here in this color, for me, the color is red. We can see the white, the white candidates. So a white candidate with 500,000 reais has about, has between 10 and 20% of chance of being elected. The same white person with 2.5 million reais in funding has almost 100% of chance of being elected. And then if you see the black, which are the blue line for me, the chance of being elected, even with the same amount of money, is considerably less. So it's not only resource and funding that explain the difference between the rates of black Brazilian candidates elected, but also races. And here is how the electoral funding is spending according to color. As I said, so the government gives a certain amount of money to the parties based on the importance the party has in the Congress. And then this party goes on and shares the money among the candidates. Here, we can say that again. The blue color represents the white candidates, the red represents the black, and the orange represents the brown mixed race candidates. So the whites get way more money and is more concentrated, and blacks get less money than whites, and also less money than mixed race people. So that means that the chance of being elected is way higher for white candidates because they've got more money. Um, and here we have like how much money each party has spent with white, black, and brown candidates. So here we have those parties here. Then MDB are parties like right center winning parties. So they spend way more money with the white candidates, who are the Greens, and not and very few and very little money with the black ones, and that goes. And that's true for pretty much all the parties. You can show here that white candidates get more money than non-white candidates, except for which country? Oh, except for this party here, that's PSOL. PSOL is a left-leaning party with very little representation in the National Congress, but is a party that has a lot of black candidates and gives money equally to all to both blacks and white candidates. But all of the other parties tend to spend more money on white candidates and less on the black candidates. Okay, here another study that shows how the relationship between race, resources, and representation. So this is a study done by Bueno and Dunning in 2017. And what they showed here is, so in the darker color, in the darker gray, you have the Brazilian population for that color race. So here, we have whites are 48% of the Brazilian population, as I showed you guys before. But they get almost 80% of the seats in the Congress. Then brown people are 43% of the Brazilian population, and they get around 20% of the seats. Black people, who are around 6 to 7% of the Brazilian population, they get around 3% of the seats in the legislative in Brazil. Here, another graph that shows the race of those who are the candidates, or here on my right, you can see that 58% of the candidates are whites, and they are 79.8% of the elected. And 41% of the candidates are black and brown, and they are only 20% of the elects. So there's a overrepresentation of whites in the Brazilian politics, and there's an underrepresentation of blacks in Brazilian politics. But then when we see in terms of if you do an intersectional study putting gender together, that explains even more the situation. So here we have on this column we have black candidates. H means male and M means female. So in the Senate, in the election of 2014 election, for the Senate, there was no black person elected, neither men nor women. But then there were 4 brown male and 1 brown woman. Then for the lower house, we had 19. Just to remember that our lower house has 15. Here it has 513 seats. From the 513 seats, only 19 went to black males, 3 to black females, 74 to black, to brown males, and 7 to brown females. So the underrepresentation of black and brown women is even more salient than the underrepresentation of black and brown men. So if you combine race and gender, black women and indigenous women are basically in existence in Brazilian politics. Today, we have only one indigenous representative in the lower house, but no more. Okay, and again, a graph that's very similar to the other one that's showing the percentage of the Brazilian black white population here in gray, and how many seats they've got in the lower house. And here, the amount of the percentage of the non-white Brazilian population and their seat representation in the lower house. So you show there is a switch. There's a larger non-white population that gets fewer seats than the white population, who represents less of the country, but is way more, is overrepresented in the lower house. And then lastly, we have the representation for city councils. There was an election back in last year, and there was a few differences in that election. One was the first election in which black and brown candidates outnumbered white candidates, and this role of distributing the federal fundings for elections to be equally divided between blacks, whites, and male and female candidates. So many of us studied if those effects of funding spending and the number of black candidates being so high, if that would reflect in more black people elected, and especially more non-white women being elected. So we have this study here that we did with the 11 Brazilian capitals. And because I'm around, yes. And it shows the following. So here in green are the white people elected for city councils. So they are like twice as many than the brown people elected, and black people elected also twice as many as the black people elected. So this is in national, like all the city councils elections in Brazil back then. But then going for cities, I will show you guys Salvador. Salvador is, as I said, the largest black population in the country. And if the largest black population in the country lives in a city, one would assume that the majority of the political representatives of the city would also be non-white, but it's wrong. So even here, you have more white and brown people elected to the city council in Salvador than black people, even though, as we can see, if you compare to the other cities, Salvador elects more black representatives than all the other cities. And so somehow the weight of the black population can also indicate a better chance for a black candidate to be elected. And then I will finish my presentation here talking about my own research on descriptive representation and what I call collective mandates in Brazil. So first I will explain what and why descriptive representation. So why is the descriptive representation? So descriptive representation is the idea that a group elects an individual to represent them who in their own characteristics mirror some of the more frequent experiences and outward manifestations of the group. So what it means? It means that if you have more women representing women, questions of interest of women will be better represented than if you only have white men representing them. And then also to curb a democratic deficit. So when the decisions shaping our lives are made by assemblies composed overwhelmingly of men, of those with no experience of discrimination or insecurity, of those from the society's ethnic majority, then you have a deficit, a democratic deficit. So we have to have a more diverse group of representatives, because then you have more perspectives being shown in politics. And then we have this case study in Brazil. That was research I did with a few colleagues. What we call collective mandates. So there are many types of collective mandates in Brazil. So there are things that we call open mandate. An open mandate is when the representative calls the population to vote on what kind of bills or what kind of politics the mandate have to put their interest on. And then you have what the specific kind of collective mandates I'm showing here is you have a number of candidates like this one, like you have 12 candidates. They run together, either having the same number on the ballot or each of them having different numbers. And then they agree to run the mandate together once one or all of them are elected. So this is the kind of collective mandate I'm using, and they try to do what I call an intersectional approach to representation. So they tend to focus on many issues regarding to the interests of women, LGBTQI plus people, indigenous people, homeless people, and many others. So they don't have usually one kind of interest, but they have many interests. They try to work with during their mandates. And then we have these three collective mandates that falls into this type I'm studying Gabinetona, which was elected. First was as an election of 2 city councils in Belo Horizonte, here where I live. Then there was a state deputy and then a federal deputy as well. Juntas, they're like a group of state deputies in Pernambuco, and Bancada Ativista, who are a group of state deputies in São Paulo. And then there's a thing called public audiences in Brazil. What are public audiences? Are like moments in which the mandate invites the population to talk about many questions of their interest. So what our study showed is that those collective mandates are very interested in culture, education, popular economy, work, and housing and participation. Those are like the main questions they try to listen to the population and then write bills about or lobby the executive to work on. And then also in terms of the bills they propose. Here we have many regarding to environmental questions, political participation. What else? Human rights, rights for the LGBT population, rights for the indigenous peoples, and also for the workers. which means, as I was trying to explain, this intersectional approach. So they come together trying to tackle many questions of that may be of interest of a population that's larger than the typical white male representative would tackle. Okay, that was what I had to say. Sorry, it took me so longer to finish, but I hope we can have a great conversation.
Perfect. That was perfect, Professor Cristiano. It was exactly 60 minutes. I don't know
great.
if you're counting.
I was thinking that was like I was taking too long to finish. Sorry.
No,
I just got caught up.
Right on time. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. And we do have many questions and many interesting questions for you. So Marcos and I will be mediating that. And I would like to start with a question raised by Bruno. Bruno is from UFMG. And oh gosh, sorry. Okay, Bruno Puccini from UFMG, and he's got an interesting question, and I'm going to add up to that question as well. Is there a consensus of what race is? How could we define it? How it correlates with ethnicity? And I'm going to broaden that up. I'm part of the board of the heteroidentification at UFMG for the quotas. And we are always, every time we go there, I don't know if people know, but to enter the university, there are some quotas for Blacks and Indigenous people, and I mean, series of quota for different people. And then the first part is easy because we have like Black people, and then we have like white people, and then we have like white people wanting to be Black because their grandmothers are Black. But then we have like the second round in which people they are not approved in the quota system, but then they how do you say it's recorrem, how do you say that they approach the board and say, I want to go for it again because I think I'm Black. And then we're always in that question: is that person Black? Is that person not Black? Does this person deserve to be in the quota system? So we are always asking ourselves about what is race, but especially what is race in Brazil, right? And I think you could work a little bit more on that.
Okay, this is a very first is a very difficult question to answer, and at the same time it's a very important question to answer, because without answering it, we cannot explain races. So I always like to switch the question up and say, first we need to understand what racism is, and then we understand what race is. Because as my favorite writer says, which is Ta-Nehisi Coates, so he says, racism is the father of race. What does that mean? You can only talk about race if there's racism. So racism is a form that many societies have chosen to divide power. So we choose one that upholds power and the other one that has no power. And then we explain that based in race. So race is a way of explaining why some of us have power and some of us have not. And that changed from country to country and from time to time. So when I was trying to explain in Brazil, if I'm here back in the colonial times, and we are not disputing power because I'm enslaved and you're free, of course there's no race. Of course there's no racism. We are not fighting for the same resources. You have and I don't. But then I'm free. And I have to go to the job market. I need to go to the education system, health system. I have to access political representation. And then those who always upheld power will say, oh, stop there. You're Black, you're not smart enough. You don't have the tools necessary. And then Blackness is created. as a way of saying you're not equal with us. You are different. And then based on that, so I cannot give you an answer saying there's a clear definition of race. No, there's not. There's a contextual, and contingent definition of race. That's different from country to country. It's different from time to time, and it's different within the same country. So a person who is seen as Black in Rio Grande do Sul might not be seen as Black in Salvador, and may not experience the same discrimination in these two different states. That's why when you're talking to me about like the heteroclassification committee, it's important to see and to say whether this person is a beneficiary or not of the quota. We have to say how this person faces discrimination here. So I look at somebody's skin color and say, oh, this person clearly faces discrimination against. Then somebody whose grandfather was Black, but this person is white or white-like. Does she face the same discrimination that a Black person who has a fair skin? Probably not. So then, I don't know if I explained. Oh, and then the difference between ethnicity. This is a very important one. Usually, like the scholars have said, that ethnicity is more related to language, difference, symbolic tools. So they are not integral part of a society. Like when you say indigenous are different, like the first language indigenous talk and learn, even in Brazil, are not Portuguese. Their symbologists, the way they address, they understand the world is different from the way white urban Brazilians understand the world. So although we share the same country, a country who actually belongs to them before then was taken from them, they do and they interpret and they interact with this country in a way that's different, consistently different from the way white Brazilians or even Black Brazilians do. So race has a lot to do with phenotypics and skin tone, and ethnicity has a lot to do with culture, language, and ways of living. But of course, again, that can be intertwined. If you go again to Latin America and you find the Garifunas are Black people from the Central America, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and other countries. They are ethnic Black groups. Colombia, even. In Colombia, you might have Black communities who live in palenques. Palenques are maroon communities, such as Quilombos in Brazil, who may be seen as ethnic groups as well. In San André Island, which is an island in Colombia, the Black population of that island don't speak Spanish, they speak English and other Creole language. So they also may be seen as an ethnic group. So this difference between ethnicity and race it can be seen as a very different thing, but it can also be intertwined.
That was excellent. Thank you very much for your answer, Professor. Marcos, please.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is from Camila Valentoni. She's a student at UFMG. And her question is, there were a lot of Asian people who immigrated in the 19th and 20th century, as well as European. Did the government sponsor this immigration too, even though they were not Caucasian?
Not. We have like we have different waves of immigration, of Asian immigration to Brazil, especially Japanese descendants. We have some related to the war, the Second War, and we had the one before in early 1900s. But that had many. There was a lot to do with poverty and trying to find new opportunities in another country. That they were not sponsored. Even actually, the bills to sponsor Europeans to come to Brazil would forbid Asians to come and Portuguese to come, because they're not seen as civilized and evolved as the white ones. So there was also a lot of discrimination against Asian people to come to Brazil. Obviously, if you see nowadays, the Asian population is being seen as the exemplary minority. The same way it occurs in the US, like that you pick up a minority and say, look, that's how you should work to be successful here. So if you're Asian and you're good at maths and you're good at this and you go to Harvard, like that's the way of doing this. So we do that. We do this a lot of the Japanese who are mostly in São Paulo and the north part of Paraná. But at the beginning, when they came to Brazil, they were very discriminated against, or even in the US, like you had concentration camps for the Japanese during the Second War. Like they were taken out of the American society as people who didn't belong there. And nowadays they are seen as this exemplary minority. So this is also a way of discriminating against, like portraying somebody so exemplary that they have to be perfect, that they cannot make mistake, is also a way to put them in a box and discriminate against them.
Excellent. Professor, we had a question from Emily about euphemisms used to talk about race. But then right after she made the question, you put that slide with I don't know how many different names, right? that are very hard to translate, but that are used as euphemisms for racism. So I think we can go on and ask Marcos, we have another question.
Yes, Luciana. So the next question is from Ícaro Bellenor, that is a student in the course of geography here at UFMG. And he's asking, in Brazil, we can see a growing movement and representation in media in the society. Emicida, I believe he is referring to a growing representation of racial diversity. Emicida, in the documentary Amarelo, é Tudo para Ontem, showed the history of Black music impact in Brazilian society. How can you see the impact of the music in the movement, especially in the Black movement?
All right, so another very complex question, and I can answer that in two ways. The first way is we can think about the culture in its broader sense as a way of surviving and resisting oppression. So this is like right from the beginning, and that's not, again, this is not particular to Brazil. In any other country, the US, other Latin American countries, European countries as well, who are multiracial and oppressed-based countries, you will see that those minority populations use culture, music, arts, even religion as a way of resisting and to make sure they're part of the society. Okay, this is like that's one of the importances. But then this culture can also be taken out of context and become a commodity and become something to be sold, as we do with hip hop, as we do with samba, as we do with many other things. Then it's very important to see how this taking back the culture, as Emicida does, and many other singers, songwriters, and artists too, as a way of bringing back the culture to its roots of resisting. But it's also, it's always a field of tension. It's never an easy one, because a culture will be taken out of context, will be used as commodity, and then will be taken back by that community, will be reinvented. It's not a fixed thing.
Excellent, thank you so much for the answer, Professor. Now we have a question from Isabella. She's from the law school at UFMG. And she asks if you believe we are moving from a field racism into a more expressive and violent one these days? And how do you see the evolution of anti-racism in Brazil?
Can you split the question in two? Because there's a question about evolving racism and the other one about the anti-racism. So let's go to the first one.
Of course.
Okay, so as I understood, it's like if racism has become more violent now than it had before. This is the first question. The second is, what is the new ways of doing anti-racism struggle, right? No, racism has not become more violent. It has always been extremely violent. And there are like many ways of violating the basic human rights of people considered others. So when I'm talking about racism, I always take in mind that like I'm using Black people because that's what I study and that's what I understand as a researcher. But it may apply to many other groups who are also considering others and minorities in different countries, in different societies, and even in Brazil. Like I'm not capable of talking about indigenous people, but when we talk about the indigenous genocide, to the point that today we have fewer than 1 million indigenous people living in a country where before they were the majority. We are talking about an extremely violent form of ethnocentrism and racism, if I can say so myself. When we talk about slavery, we're talking about 300 to 400 of forced working, of being taken out of the lands, of being stripped out of the culture. This is extremely violent. So racism has never been less violent, has always been violent, and will always be. So I see no ways of racism not being violent. But you can explain the violence in terms of its physical sense, but also in terms of its cultural and lack of representation and the destruction of a Black person's self-esteem, of sense of worthiness, of indigenous people, and so on. So, so racism has not becoming more violent. It has always been violent. The violence is different. Like, what is the specificity of the violence nowadays? It has to do with police brutality, and it has to do with mass incarceration in Brazil or in the US. Like in other countries, you might have other types of violence, of state-sponsored violence against Black people. But in Brazil, it has to do with what people call the genocide of the Black population. It has to do with mass incarceration.
But I think we could say that we are more aware of violence. That's why we feel it more.
Yes, right? Like a lot of people have a lot of people have been said that now we have cameras and we have cell phones. Right. So situations like the George Floyd's last year, João Alberto, I forgot, in that supermarket in the south of Brazil. Exactly. Those kids who are taken or like were killed by the police and it's being shown on cameras. Of course, it gives us, and also have social media. We can make a situation goes viral, and then we get more angry about those situations. So probably it's not more violence, but it's being shown.
Yeah, probably if those two examples you gave here in Brazil and Floyd in the United States, if they happened like 2 or 3 years ago, we wouldn't even be aware that they actually happened, because this would happen all the time and we just wouldn't see it, right?
Exactly, right? Yes. And then about the anti-racism. So the anti-racism struggle also changed in the way racism changes. Because as I said, racism it has to do with power. It has to do with othering the people from whom you want to take power off. And also, so it changed because it changed depending on what it's at stake. think about us 20 years ago, when Black people didn't go to university at the higher rates they go today. We didn't have a discussion about quotas or people trying to, what's the word for like when people try to deceive the system of quotas, especially when they want to go to medical school, law school, engineering. So that means that a lot of people who always had access to the university now feel that they don't have more because black people and poor people started to have. So if you compare the university today from the university I studied 20 years ago, it's like two completely different worlds. I mean, they are incomparable. And that brings a lot of questions, a lot of struggles, and a lot of fighting between students, between professors, between the administration. It's a lot of things that going on. And so the anti-racist struggle to access to higher education, it's very different today than it was 30 years ago. So it has to be more cautious, more aware of people who are doing wrongs, pretending to be blacks to have access to the university and stuff like that. Now, for the political representation as well, for many years, we didn't think about the political underrepresentation of blacks. We simply took we took for granted that politics was a thing for white, rich male. But then it started with the women saying we need to have more seats. And as women took places in office and started doing better jobs than the white males did, they would think, well, we could expand that for more people. And then this struggle comes along with a struggle that has to do with the struggle led by the women's movement or the LGBTQ. So what I think that's the future or the good future for the anti-racism struggle is it has to be always related to the other struggles of other social movements who are bringing about more evolution, not evolution, well, it's not the word I want to say, but like bringing more progress to the society. So it has to come together and think together with the LGBT communities, women's, indigenous. It cannot be an isolated way of thinking to access, because a person is not only black. A person is black and is a woman, is poor, is middle class, is lesbian, is gay. So a person holds way too many identities for you to box them in just one and say that's the way it goes. So it doesn't work that way.
Excellent. I just want to add one piece of information that is very important about the quota system in Brazil, and it has to do directly with UFMG, where I work and I'm a civil servant there. When people say that we took spots from other people to give to the quota system or to give them to the Black people, the indigenous people, whoever, it's very important to remind all of you that before actually implementing or meanwhile implementing the quota system, we had a great program called Reúne, which doubled the spots, or more than doubled. So at UFMG, before Reúne, before the quota system, we had 25,000 spots, 25,000 students. Then we had Reúne, and now we have over 53,000 spots at the university. So we did not take away spots from anyone to give out to any other one. So this complaint about, white people's problems. And I just want to say that.
Yes, that's right.
Marcus, please.
Okay, Luciana. So the next question is from Kenneth. He's from the Technological University of Panama. And his question, is there a correlation between racism in Brazil and health? For example, now with the pandemic crisis, lower rates in vaccination in the Black community or less rates on daily basis to get health insurance or to get treatments in hospitals. Also, if there's some type of discrimination in the hospital towards these groups.
Yes. So there, again, let's explain that in a way that I think it's very important. Again, I always like to start with racism before, because then we can move on and understand things. So racism has always been a thing in the health system. So we know there are like a large number of studies showing that the access, the Black people's access to health, to the health system is unequal to the white people's. So in Brazil, as I said, so there's a relationship between, or there's a correlation, a higher correlation between race and poverty, or race and class, not necessarily into race and poverty, but definitely into race and class. And we have a public health system that's supposed to be universal. So most of the people who are using the system is Black people. You know? But then when the pandemic hit us back in March 2020, this collide between class and race was shown right away. So back in Brazil, back in the day, it was like many people, many upper middle class Brazilians came from vacations in Europe who had been infected with the COVID back then. And then there's this story which it's very interesting, because there was this family who came from Italy. One of them, I think the woman who was diagnosed with COVID, and then they asked their maid, who was a Black person who lived 50 kilometers away, to stay in the house with them, and they would pay more for this person who stayed there. And then this person was, because then we learned that some people had died before, but this person was shown on the newspapers as being the first person to die because of COVID in Brazil. And she was a Black domestic worker who was taking for her house to take care of somebody who was sick and who was a white person. This white person was still alive. So a lot of the people who were killed, or people who had what I call like the primary, the frontline workers, even in health, like the nurses, or people who work doing delivery, drivers and stuff, they tend out to be Black. So they're facing more higher rates of infection and also of death, because it's this conjunction of many factors, like that they don't have the privilege, as I do or many of us have, to work from home, and then, or like to call somebody to take care of their grocery shopping lists, or to take them to work. They have to work because that's the only way they can survive. But at the same time, they're being exposed to these conditions. And then when the government start doing, when we start vaccinating people, they were not on the first list of people to be vaccinated. So the vaccination as well was made in a way that benefited white middle-class people and not them. So that racism, again, it's not that like it changed, that the access to the health system changed because of COVID. But COVID just was a way of showing how racism is so salient in our society that made many of the Black people die, while a lot of white people survived because they had way more access to everything and were less exposed to the virus.
Exactly. That's sad, but thank you very much for your for your answer, Professor. And then now we have a question from Rodrigues Franco, and he talks about the book, Gilberto Freire's book. Despite the misconceptions on the structural conception of racism in Brazil, which would you say are the ongoing virtues of Gilberto Freire's interpretation of our society?
You mean the ones who are still hold true, or the ones that are still used to explain the Brazilian society?
Maybe you can make a parallel between the
Okay.
two.
because not everything that Paulo Freire is, Paulo Freire, no, sorry.
Paulo Freire is someone else.
Different Freires, different Freires.
Different.
So,
Yeah.
don't mistake one for another, so.
Yes, I know.
Not everything that Gilberto Freire said in those two first books, which is Casa Grande Senzala and Sobrados e Mocambos, are untrue. They're like exaggerations, I would say. And some of them are like big fat lies. Some of the big fat lies are still being used in Brazil to explain the society. And one of those lies is this, that the Brazilian slavery, or the slavery in Brazil was not so cruel as the slavery in the US. Because how Gilberto Freire came with this idea. So he was studying mainly slaves, or enslaved people, not slaves, enslaved people who were in the Casa Grande, so the master's house. So people who did the work as maids, babysitters, ama de leite, I have no idea how to say in English, but like ama de leite, it was like who give milk to the babes. And so the relationship with them and the masters tend to be softened because of the interaction between intimacy, because they shared so much intimacy with the masters and the slaves, that was seen to him as many as not so cruel as the way slavery worked elsewhere. But this is a big lie. So like there's many other studies showing that slavery in Brazil was very cruel and very violent, the same way it worked in any other countries. But then there's a point to be made, and I think this point is important, that the racial mixture in itself, it's not negative. Like people may choose and can choose their sexual affective partners the way they want, and this relationship be not necessarily an oppressive one. Because so there's a way of living your life or choosing your partners and other things that's still that's up to you. You decide what to do in your life. And so I think this, for one side, the lie about racism being, slavery not being so violent and cruel, it's untrue, and is a lie that's still being told today. And there's this question about the personal, the individual choices to marry, to have sex, and other stuff that we need to talk about in a more comprehensive way, and not be so strict about this was always a way of oppressing Black people and make them disappear, because it's not necessarily true. But it's not necessarily true as well that mixing with other people is always good. I mean, it depends. The explanation is not so easy.
Thank you very much, Professor Cristiano. So the next question is from Ursula Dahmen from the University of Münster in Germany. And her question is about the rates of Black and POC people in politics. Are the rates improving the numbers of political representation, as in the university racial and social quotas, or are those rates in political field discussed?
Let's see if I understood. We have very few politicians, Black politicians in Brazil, as I said, especially Black female politicians. Like they compose about 2 to 3% of all the legislative in Brazil, and I'm saying like from city councils to state assemblies to the Congress, and they're like only 3% of the mayors in Brazil. And there's right now we have in Brazil there are like 27 states. They're non-Black person occupying in the position of a governor in Brazil. But there is a movement of improving that. There's a movement that became with, and that's even related to the question about Emicida, that a lot of cultural movements back in 2010, movements from the hippie hoppy, youth groups, groups related to Carnival, who start to also trying to take over a space in the office as political representatives. And many of them became candidates and were elected, such as Áurea Carolina in Belo Horizonte. When she was elected, she was the first Black female who became, and she got many votes. I mean, she was the first one. She was the one that got most votes during that election. And then you had Marielle Franco, who was assassinated in 2018, and she was a city council representative in Rio de Janeiro. And after that, I mean, there was this backlash against the growing number of Black representatives, and this backlash is mostly represented by the assassination of Marielle Franco, but that didn't make people go back and not try to hold offices. Much the contrary. A lot of people start to run to offices after Marielle's death, and then you have more people holding political positions now. And then you have changes, I mean, many changes. One of these changes has to do with the distribution of electoral funds. There has to be equal for men and women, and also now Black people. There is also an attempt to create a law for quotas in the parties for Black people, which I don't think is a good idea, but that's not a debate we can have right now. And I think resources, I mean, sharing the resources equally is enough, or it's good enough for improving the political representation of Black people in Brazil. I might be wrong.
Professor, because together with this, the answer you are giving right now has to do with Juliana's question, which would be the next question. She's asking if only this campaign financing being equal would be enough, or this underrepresentation has to do with racial biases, for example.
Okay, so the studies we have, because I think the two questions is this. So I think, like, just to finish the first one, so we're improving in terms of Black political representation because a lot of social movements and a lot of Black leaders have chosen to run for office. And also because our society is more aware of racism and sexism and LGBT phobia. And then a lot of Brazilian electors are consciously voting for candidates who are not white male. So just to think about Brazil, again, we have Duda, what's her surname? Salabert?
Salabert, Duda Salabert.
Yes, this. She is a trans woman who used to be a school teacher in a private school in Belo Horizonte, and she ran twice. She ran for the Senate a few years ago, and she got a huge. The turnout was very good, and then she ran for city council last year, and she was the one who got the most votes, and she got votes all across the political spectrum. People who usually voted for the right-leanings, politicians voted for her because they're interested in animal rights. People who are interested in the LGBT questions voted for her because of these questions. People who are interested in education voted for her because of this. People who are interested in veganism questions voted for her. So she's a person who, as I said before, like this idea of like, putting together the many identities and in such a way that it can be politicized, it's a political capital that is being used by those people. And it can be used in a very good way. So Duda, the election of Duda, and then you have Erika Hilton, who was also a trans woman who was elected in São Paulo, and many others have shown that these social movements are taking the right decision to run for office because there is a vacancy, there's a necessity for those people to be there, and people are ready to vote for them. So if they have resources, if they have funding, then you can put those people way more in office. So then come to the question. The studies have shown we cannot separate racism from the lack of resources. I was trying to say in my slide that party recruitment is a way of diminishing the chances of a Black person to be elected. And I didn't explain that. I would like to explain. What happens? We know in Brazil that what a person needs to be elected. This person needs to be running for a second term. So candidates who are running for a second term, they tend to be elected at higher rates than people who are running for the first time, for obvious reasons. They are known, they have a work to show, and they have access to the machine. Then, if you are a member of a family of politicians, so in Brazil, Brazil is a country in which the renovation of our representative body is very high. But if you look at their surnames, they are the grandson, or they are the son, or they are the nieces, or they are the nephews of somebody who is already in office and who has been there for a century. So you have these families who have been running the country forever. And then money. So being somebody who is running for a second term, being from a family of politicians, and having money. Who have that? White, middle class, male. That's why our overrepresentation of white males in the politics is so huge. In any other countries, you have an overrepresentation of people from a certain background. But the Brazilian overrepresentation is way more acceptable. Our rates of female representatives are the lowest in now the countries we know. Like we are together with, I forgot which country, which is a small country in Africa. In Latin America, no other country has less female representatives as Brazil. Like if you go to Chile, Argentina, Mexico now has a equal proportion of male and female representatives all the way from bottom to the top. And now public elect offices. So that said, we cannot change if the person is running for the first or second time. We cannot change if the person is or not is from a family of politicians, but we can choose how much money this person gets. So to elect more women, to elect more Black people, we will need to give more money. And then we can separate racism or sexism from the lack of funding. Now we don't have data, enough data that can tell me people are not elected based on racism. We can show people are not elected because they don't have enough money. So if you get money, that's why I'm saying that quota is not necessarily a good way of improving Black political representation in Brazil, because we already have a lot of Black candidates showing up, but we don't have them being elected. So the problem is not that we don't have enough Black candidates, we don't have them being elected. So if you give more money to these candidates, if you give more TV spots, more time on TV for them, if they show more on social media, will they be elected? If the answer is yes, then racism is not necessarily a variable that holds them back. If after giving them all the necessary conditions that we know that make a candidate a good candidate, and still they are not elected, then we can go back and look at racism.
I think you gave the example of Duda, and Duda is a great example because Minas Gerais, our state, and our city, Belo Horizonte, we are very, it's very, there's a lot of conservatism, right? We're very conservative people. And Duda being elected, I got impressed, right? Because it was not about race or racism or whatever, but rather because she got this representation, right? Juliana goes on, and I think it's important to note what she says, to talk about how do political leaders like Bolsonaro impact voters' perception of candidates from racially underrepresented groups? And I think you could talk a little bit, I think you could talk about this conservative wave we're having lately, and how does that impact on all the progress we have had over the past years, and then now we have this big wave of,
of political nonsense. This is a good and great question. Brazil has always been a very conservative country, and until the early 2000s, very little progress on racial equality had been made. And then we had this huge wave of progress. That was, then there was like the quotas for the universities. Also have affirmative actions policies for work, especially for public selections at the federal level. Many cities and states also started to sponsor bills and political change to improve the lives of the Black population, to the access of the health system. Anyway, so there are like many measures being made throughout the 2000s that improved drastically the lives of Black people. Many of the Black students I'm seeing here from UFMG probably wouldn't be here without those policies made back in 2000. All right, but some of these policies can be unmade if we have a conservative and a government that's against the rights of those peoples. That's what we are seeing now with Bolsonaro. So there are like two ways he is deteriorating the rights of not only Black people, I would say like all underrepresented peoples in Brazil, because it's a wide range of people that he hates. Like that goes from women, indigenous, Black, LGBTQ, even himself he must hate. But what he does, first symbolically, and in terms of discourse. So this is a person who, since we've known him publicly, he's famous for saying stupid things about people, being homophobic, being misogynist, saying stupid things about Black people, being overtly racist. I mean, he's not somebody we didn't know he was what he is, just like Trump in the West. So symbolically, what that means that there's a conversation that we had been going for decades of. There's a public space and there's a private space. In public, you're not openly racist. You're not openly homophobic. You're not openly misogynist. You might be in your private life, but like in the public sphere, not. Once somebody arises and gains momentum, being exactly what we've told not to be publicly, we open the door for a lot of people doing so. So the numbers of the violence against LGBT people rose after him coming to office, against Black people, against women. Also, police officers are less accountable, are holding less accountable now for their actions, especially actions against Black people, against poor people, against women. So what that means, like that symbolically, he opens up a society that we are holding accountable for so long. And we will lose that for many decades to come. I mean, he will leave office, fortunately, hopefully, but not necessarily his ideas will. Because his ideas will run deep in our society for many years to come. And we will have to redo the work we did before again. So symbolically, that's how he's ruining our social life. But then in terms of undoing policies, are not giving money to these policies, or putting somebody who is a deeply Christian against rights in the Ministry of Human Rights, or sponsoring bills who are against the rights of those people. So the rights who are giving, not giving is not the word I want to say, but it's lacking a better word, but the rights who are given to Black people, women, and other groups in this short window of the 2000s, they are at risk, at very risk. Let's just to give an example, in 2022, next year, we'll be having hearings in the Congress about maintaining or not the quota system at the universities. So depending on how this conversation goes during this time, we may lose a policy that's so necessary to keep the university with more diversity and more inclusivity. So that's the two ways he is ruining our lives.
Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that. That's but thank you for your words. And then, if you don't mind, we're running out of time, but we have a very nice final question. I think you might want to answer, save some couple more minutes. Max, please.
Yes.
Okay, so this question is from Aaron Wilford. He's from the University of British Columbia in Canada and Northwestern in Chicago. When talking about Pan-Africanism, we'll look at the Caribbean, US, Europe, and even the Francophone world. Did the lack of Black consciousness in Brazil, you mentioned it, keep some Afro-Brazilian from participating in Pan-Africanism? Is there research on Brazilian Black internationalism? How do Afro-Brazilians understand themselves in the broader world?
Wow. That's there is, and I think since the beginning, of course, I didn't have a time here to talk about this, but there is a large number of Brazilians, Afro-Brazilians, who identify with the Africanism. Especially now, I would say there's in the philosophy, I know at least two people who have led movements of Black internationalism in Brazil recently. No, not before. Okay, but that's like I would say this is a minority. This is a thinking. This way of thinking. It's in a minority of Black Brazilians for many reasons. And I would say the first reason is Brazil is a country that sees itself, and Afro-Brazilians as well, as isolated from Latin America and isolated from other countries. Like we usually, when we talk about Brazilian politics, Brazilian national identity, language and other things, we tend not to see ourselves as linked to Latin America. This tends to occur when Brazilians go abroad and then they gain a new identity that was given to them as, oh, you're Latino. And then they have to reinvent themselves as Brazilians living abroad, not being entirely the way they thought they were before. So many Afro-Brazilians don't get the chance to live, to go abroad, and to get in touch with many ways of thinking about Black internationalism or Afrocentrism or many other diasporic connections of the Caribbean, Latin America, other African countries, Europe, in the Americas in general, as you said. So this difficulty to go abroad and then reinvent our own identity is one of the problems. Like very few Black Brazilians know about Latin American history as well. I have a book on Afro-Latin America. It was, if I'm right, it's probably the first book reading about this question in Portuguese. Even though the topic, the research topic is being studied in the US and other Latin American countries for a century. So we're way behind in terms of that. Many of the literature who tackles Black internationalism or Afrocentrism and other questions. They are in English or Spanish or French. Brazilians don't usually speak a second language. There are few translations to Brazil. Just to give you an example, the works of Angela Davis, written in 1975, were translated to Portuguese 4 years ago. So we're way behind in terms of actual connection, meaning people traveling and getting to know other cultures, other people, other ways of thinking, in terms of translating these ideas to make the ideas travel and reinvent what we think about ourselves, and also a country that thinks of itself as isolated linguistically, culturally, politically, in a continent where we are. So there are many reasons for us not, for this way of thinking being so minorities or minoritary in our country.
Excellent. I'm so very much sorry that we ran out of time. I would like to ask the professor if you could share some contact, like your email. There are some other questions students might want to reach you.
Yes.
So if you can.
If people want to hit me and write me an email, I can talk to them.
Yeah.
I mean, not rapidly, because you know our lives are very busy.
No. So your email would be
it's Cristiano R. Let me put it here. Can I?
Okay, yeah, sure. Go ahead. And thank you very much. Meanwhile, while you write in the chat box your email, thank you ever so much for the enlightening and insightful talk on such important matter. We do have other questions, but unfortunately, we won't be able to address all of them. And again, it's been an honor to have you here with us once again on behalf of the Office of International Affairs of Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. I would like to thank you. Also, Professor Davison Lopes, who is our Deputy Dean of International Affairs, and also Professor Lucas Lima, our coordinator for the Summer School on Brazilian Studies. Would like to convey their kindest regards to yourself. And I'm sure everyone enjoyed it so much, and I hope to be we could be able to count on you for our next editions. And fortunately, face to face, so we can hug each other, so we can see each other.
Go to your ching.
Yes, and drink coffee together, right?
Yeah.
And but thank you ever so much once again. And if you have some last words you would like to address to our students.
I'd just like to thank you for the invitation. I mean, it's a pleasure to be talking about these topics. Today I'm very tired because yesterday was my birthday and I celebrated a little bit. So if I was not at my best, if I was not at my best, I just sorry, it was just that I had to party yesterday.
Okay. Sure, of course, yes.
But the questions were amazing. I mean, it was a very rich conversation. And I'm looking forward to have more of these conversations face to face in the years to come. So you guys can count on me.
Thank you very much. And then, guys, I would like to remind you that in a few minutes, right, Marcos, we're going to have the Portuguese classes. So be ready for that. And also, I would like to remind you that tomorrow at 2 p.m., we're going to have a blast with Professor Nicoleles, who will be teaching the lecture. Professor Nicoleles, Miguel Nicoleles is one of the most important scientists, I would say, in the world nowadays. And of course, one of our best scientists, Brazilian scientists. And he will be sharing some words with us tomorrow. So we'll be delighted to have you all with us tomorrow. And of course, we'll meet each other again tomorrow for another session of the Summer School on Brazilian Studies. Thank you all very much. We'll be seeing each other. Bye-bye. Thank you.